Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of Risk and Margin Talks. I'm Andy Beck, and today we're excited to have Scott Savage here to talk about risk and margin a little bit. And Scott, I'll let you introduce yourself and let everybody know kind of what you're doing these days.
Sounds good. Thanks, Andy. So my name's Scott Savage. I work at the Sawtooth Avalanche Center in Ketchum, Idaho, in the Sun Valley area. So I'm the director now. I've been here for about 9 years, and I work as a regional backcountry avalanche forecaster. So we basically come up with um, effectively a risk assessment, a hazard assessment, and then the main part of our job really is to take something really complex and try to make it simple. So we issue public safety risk communication products that the public can use to make good or bad, but hopefully good or better decisions when they're out recreating in the backcountry, and for people working too. So professionals use it as well. Previous to that, so about a decade doing that, and before that, I was working at a ski area in Montana at Big Sky. I worked as a ski patroller, then avalanche forecaster, and then snow safety director. So, we're really heavily into avalanche mitigation, that side of things, where you're trying to create avalanches at Big Sky. So I tend to say I was an avalanche maker for that roughly 20-year part of my career, where now I'm more of an avalanche avoider. How do I define risk? Well, my personal, the way that I would look at it, personal definition would be just the chance of something ugly happening, the chance of having ugly consequences when you're doing something.
Yep.
And we have a conceptual model of avalanche hazard, which, it's like most definitions of risk in a potentially dangerous environment, where you have, risk being a combination of hazard, exposure, vulnerability. For us, the vulnerability it's pretty static. You're one person, you're not shielded in a bunker. It's not like we're going to wear, armored suits that have scuba breathing apparatuses. So we're pretty vulnerable. So that's kind of a constant. We tend to ignore that. So really we look at it as, hazard. What's the danger from avalanches? If we're speaking avalanches specifically, and exposure. Are you in the terrain? And if you have the potential to get hit by an avalanche, where in the terrain are you in relation to where that avalanche releases? So, you can look at it technically, or kind of layman's terms. It's easier to understand what's the chance of something bad happening.
Are you a risk taker, do you think?
Yeah.
Do you consider yourself one?
Well, physically, no. I'm pretty mellow. And part of that is, part of it's age, that I'm 50 something and, have a wife and a kid. And just as you mature, most people anyhow, tend to become more risk averse, especially with physical hazards like that. But even when I was younger, I was always kind of measured. Like I would look at things and try to figure out what could potentially happen to me before doing it, compared to, like, say, my wife, who's like, I wonder what happened if I jumped off the first story of this barn. So she did it, and and gets hurt doing it. And so naturally I'm not physically, I would say intellectually and financially I am. So it doesn't, that's the interesting thing about risk tolerance. It doesn't apply to all facets of your life. It's not a general personality trait or characteristic, where it differs in different segments of your life.
So what do you think the most dangerous part of your job is now, and then compare that to when you worked in snow safety at a ski area?
No, that's a great question, because they are dramatically different. The most dangerous part of my job now is driving, especially when we're towing a snowmobile trailer, but in full-on whiteout conditions where the road probably should have been closed already. And we're there, the 2-lane mountain pass has become barely wide enough to get a full-size pickup through it, and the snow's over the wheel wells on both sides, so you can't stop even if you want. You just hope that there's not a plow coming the other direction. So that is by far the most dangerous part in my mind, and frankly with the other people that I work with in our operation. That is the sketchiest part of what we do, is the driving part of it. And that's different where, at Big Sky, when I was working there, and I started there in 1991, and the avalanche world, avalanche mitigation and avalanche forecasting is really young. It's I'd say we're toddlers now, and it was in its infancy back then.
Yep.
So it was, to the outward observer, and I'm sure it's no different than fire, structural fire or wildland fire. That back in the 80s, it's probably, if you look at what people were doing, it's probably the Wild West back then. Stuff that would never fly now.
Right.
And it wasn't because people were necessarily riskier. It's just, we didn't have the institutional experience to figure out, okay, this doesn't make sense.
Right.
So back then it was definitely doing active avalanche mitigation, where our job basically as avalanche professionals at a ski area, like Big Sky there, I think then when I was working there, around 120 avalanche paths. So every time it snows or the wind blows and you create hazard, you need to make sure that every run that you're going to open is safe before you open it to the public. So you're making a binary open it or close it decision about every slope. And if there is avalanche hazard, which oftentimes there was, we would, I think, run about 700 avalanches a year back then that were big enough to injure or kill someone in a typical season. So you're using both explosives and just ski cutting, so skiing across a slope at a pretty high rate of speed, going from safe point A to safe point B,
right,
and in the right conditions when the avalanches aren't huge, and then you actually trigger the avalanches at your skis. So doing that, you can picture, if you think that a slope's going to slide and you're skiing across it to make it slide, there's obviously a chance you can get caught in it. So that's a lot more dangerous. And then also throwing explosives too, where the vast majority of the shots are deployed by you stand in what should be a safe place, throw them out onto the slope. But there's some spots where it kind of dares you to get a little bit closer to be able to throw that shot where you want it to be.
So when you started doing control work at a ski area at Big Sky, was there a difference in what you thought the riskiest part of your job would be versus what it actually was?
I remember my mentors right when I started, them saying we want to make sure that driving to work is the most dangerous part of our job. I don't think that was the case then. And the statistics bear that out. If you look at it nationally, over the years, the number of avalanche professionals that get killed in avalanches versus the number of avalanche professionals that get killed driving, whether it's to work or not.
Right.
So, I think it took me a while to realize, how real and how dangerous it was. Because it'd be the same thing with fire or any other, or being a pilot. I would assume that right away you don't really understand those first few years exactly how spooky it can be, and then you see enough to really, both experiences that you have and just being around it near that, in that environment, and then you tend to get that a lot more guttural understanding, for lack of a better term, of how real the hazard is. So yeah, that definitely changed. Where at first, day one, you're wide-eyed, terrified. It's like, someone's putting an explosive in my hand. Now what am I going to do with this thing? So at first, you're terrified and you realize there's a ton of risk, and then you get that probably too much of a comfort level with it for a couple, most people, it seems like it's a couple few years, 1 to 3 years. And then you have that better understanding, and you see something to put the fear of God into you in that time frame.
We see it in fire all the time. I can take a 3 or 4 year firefighter, and depending on what he happened to be around for, as far as calls and the right station and the right shift and everything else, his 5 years might be dramatically different than somebody else's 5 years. He might have a completely different experience, something like you say, bad that happened, and they comes out of it the other side to be a lot more risk aware. How did you guys deal with that within snow safety?
Yeah, that was a really hard part. We're figuring out, like in the snow safety world, you're always in pairs, teams of either 2 or more. And in some cases, some of the routes where like you're on a ridge, then you might have 3 or 4 people working. But for the most part, it would be 2. And you always want to have, someone who's been around for a while, no matter what,
Yeah.
as one of those two team members. And then inevitably you're going to end up pairing, the people who just, it's a numbers game, the inexperienced folks need to gain experience. You're not going to put them with other inexperienced folks, and
Right.
especially on the more hazardous days when the hazard's up there on the scale. So yeah, you try to, really pay attention in communicating with the more experienced folks that you have a really open channel of communication with, and just keep prying them for information about how people are coming along.
Looking back to the ski area first and then talk about what you guys do at Sawtooth, but do you think people outside of a snow safety department at a ski area or outside of a ski patrol have that same perception of how risky it is, and maybe why or why not?
Yeah, that's a great question. They don't at all. Whenever I say, yeah, I'm an avalanche forecaster and we're out in the backcountry evaluating avalanche hazard, they're like, well, you have the most dangerous job in the world. And, some people will just be like, yeah, well, it's not as bad as you think, and you move along. But if you're
Right.
going to have that conversation with someone who really wants to understand it, it's, my job now, it's not a dangerous job. And frankly, at the ski area either right now, they're not dangerous jobs. You're just in a very dangerous environment.
Right.
And the job becomes as dangerous as you and your operation make it, basically. So right now, we can eliminate, if you look at the risk, it's, hazard times exposure effectively. We can
Right.
make our exposure zero. I don't have to be an avalanche trained to do my job. So the avalanche part of it, I can take that totally out of the equation and still do a, almost as good a job as far as getting information to be able to communicate to the public without ever setting foot in avalanche terrain most of the time. So that's really not that much of a problem with the ski area world. It's a lot different because if you're going to open something to the public, then if you're afraid to go there yourself, you're not open it to the public.
Right.
And it becomes a lot more difficult because there is this, big internal pressure. We wouldn't see it from above, but there's that, pride. I mean, effectively it's ego, but pride's probably a better word. It doesn't have the negative connotation.
Right.
That can-do attitude to get the job done.
Yep.
You want to be able to open as much terrain as you can as quickly as possible. And, that obviously competes with safety, having that internal pressure right there. So I think, and the fact that you're out there triggering avalanches. So the perception of that job being dangerous is probably pretty accurate what the public thinks as far as operational, the avalanche makers,
Yeah.
whether it's highway crews or, anyone who's feet in the snow out triggering avalanches, not doing it remotely.
Right.
It's a dangerous environment. And because of our, the various mental traps that we can fall into, it can become a dangerous job.
How accurately do people in snow safety, do you think, perceive those changes in real time?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. If we were totally emotionless and didn't have all the cool chemicals in our brain that allow us to have fun and be scared, then we would be able to do it really well, but we don't, unfortunately. I think we do it pretty well most of the time, but when people have accidents or, events, it's that when it's not most of the time, and that's exactly what's happening, that you're not seeing the changes or the clues that you're getting. And, I talked about it a little bit, but whether it's a strong motivation, a goal-oriented thing that causes you to put the blinders on and not see things, or just the fact that, what you're doing as an avalanche forecaster, just like structural fire, you live to all right, we got to burn a building.
Right.
There's a serious pump from that. And that's, it's brain chemistry. You have all these chemicals going in there that make it pleasurable, exciting, fun, action.
Yep.
And that causes you to, your senses are stimulated, so you see more, but what actually comes in, you may have the blinders on and you may miss the really important information that's telling you that, hey, things are changing right now, or this isn't what I expected it to be.
Yeah, you
So,
start seeing what reinforces what you want to be doing.
Yeah, totally.
Within snow safety and forecasting, maybe talk about what you do now and then contrast it with working at Big Sky. How do you guys talk about risk in your job and how do you attempt to measure it?
Yeah, so I think the key is to look at it holistically. Maybe I'll start with what I do now, just because it's more current, and then I'll go into the way back time machine and think about how we did it. But currently, we like if we're going to go out in the field, there's a very set process. So any day that we're going out, we have a field trip planning sheet where we'll go through what is the hazard, what's our confidence in our evaluation of the hazard, what terrain is off limits, what's our plan for how we're going to travel, kind of our strategic mindset, and then what measures are we going to take to avoid or mitigate hazard, which is basically avoiding it. And then we have employee or colleague buy-off on that plan. So just doing that plan, I'd say there are a few times a year when I look at it, it's like, as soon as you put something down on paper, you're seeing how the accident report can read. So that helps a lot, that kind of pre-mortem type exercise.
Yep.
So you'll catch yourself a few times a year and say, nah, this isn't a good idea. I need more margin than that. So, and then also having the colleague read through what you're doing and where you're going and why. Yep. We don't catch each other very often, but there've been, a handful of times when we'll say, nah, I don't know about that. And so I think, doing it that way, a very formal procedure, and it's kind of a luxury where we don't have huge time constraints from that standpoint. It's not like getting the alarm for a fire and heading out there, where we have the time to do that planning and to tweak things, an extra 10, 15 minutes to come up with plan B beforehand isn't going to make or break what's going on. So that's kind of a luxury for sure. And like when I say holistically, so there, a lot of operations that do backcountry forecasting don't allow solo travel. So they're always going to have partners no matter what, where, as partner dynamics and, breakdowns in communication can lead to accidents a lot of the time. So for us, we feel at the Sawtooth Avalanche Center, we feel pretty strongly that, there are a lot of days when if it's, say a considerable avalanche danger, which is getting pretty scary for people who don't really know what they're doing. I'd way rather be solo and just stay out of avalanche terrain, and I'm not going to get caught in an avalanche, versus if I have someone, say you were out visiting me coming from out of town, someone that knew how to ski, knew a little bit about traveling around, and you're going to introduce this expert halo, or you're going to be thinking, sweet, I'm going out with the pro. This guy's been doing this forever. We're going to get to go do some cool stuff. And I'll have that in the back of my mind. It's like, I want to show them an interest in time. You'll kind of get closer to poking the dragon than you need to.
Yeah.
So, I think it is really important to look at things holistically and, adapt any policies or create or adapt any policies or procedures. So you leave room to do things that, the whole concept of why would you travel solo? It's always safer to travel with a partner. Well, except when it isn't.
Yep.
And as long as you can define that, beforehand, when you're creating your risk treatment plan or your safety plan, whatever you're going to do.
Yeah.
So that's how we deal with it here at the Sawtooth. And then back at Big Sky, it was a lot looser on, we wouldn't have a strategic mindset. Basically it was an informal way of doing a very similar thing when I was the snow safety director. So you'd come in early, you'd figure out, kind of how scary it is. We wouldn't rate it on a scale, but you're going to have this intuitive, is it a kind of a minor day? as far as a hazard, a moderate, or is it way up there?
Or is it spicy?
Yeah, very, yeah, moderate, spicy, and like extreme heat kind of thing.
Right. Yep.
And you would adjust basically the route schedule, and at times we'd go up and we'd only send, like on the days when you don't know how spicy it is, it could be like off the scale, you don't even want to send anyone out. We would send one team out there. Some of the, like, say, two of the most experienced people who aren't afraid to say, nope, it's a no-go. We're not sending anyone out. We're just going to sit tight. So I'd say, that was the main way that we would treat it differently, would be altering the teams that are going to go out, either the individuals who are on them. And
Right.
at times when, and it'd be, heartbreaking. And I had it when I was a rookie too, or a really young person. They said, sorry, you're not going to go out today.
Right.
That's just a fact. And of course, the folks, when you're saying that to them, they're bummed out. But
because we're all wired to go. We're gonna go. We want to go do work.
You want to go and you want to get that experience, and you want to see the interesting stuff. And the only way to get it is to know there, go there, to be there,
Right.
and see it up front. But yeah, I think, and talking about it, we probably, I'd say it was pretty rare that we would ever use the word risk back in the 90s. We would just, say it's too dangerous or too sketchy, or,
Yeah.
we don't trust it. But I think that's one difference in the industry as a whole is that, and that kind of started happening more in the 2000s, and it's become pretty, in the last decade, it's pretty standard that people will use that conceptual model and speak specifically about risk hazard exposure.
I wanted to ask you, what impact stories have in your job, do you think?
Yeah, stories are huge. Right now we have a lot fewer. Well, part of it's there are 4 people working in our operation at the Sawtooth Avalanche Center, 4 full-time forecasters compared to 40 plus at a ski area. So you're just going to have a lot fewer stories. It's just a numbers game, close calls, near misses. But we have weekly staff meetings, and anytime we have anything that's remotely close to a close call, or just something that happened where we changed our plan midstream, we always talk about that. It's incredibly powerful to be able to learn. I mean, we've talked about this a ton. People learn by stories. So you're going to learn better by being able to associate what happened with the story, with all that rich detail and the emotion that comes along with it, compared to just reading a scientific paper that has a bunch of graphs and a bunch of facts.
Right.
I'm not discounting the value of rigorous scientific study, looking at numbers and hard data at all, but people tend to learn better with anecdotes. They're powerful. Yeah, exactly. Like at Big Sky, whenever we had a patroller get caught in an avalanche, they would we'd say they have to. I don't, if someone really didn't want to, we wouldn't make them, but they had to write it up, and we'd tell them you can do it from the perception or from the perspective of a bird flying above, watching what you were doing. Make it interesting, make it a creative writing exercise, however you want to do it. And we ended up with this, great kind of collection of stories and by being able to introduce some creativity to it, people would have some fun with it. Like one of them did write it from the perspective of a crow flying above them. Awesome. And the crow's like, so look at, and then I see this dumbass ski across this thing when it was obvious even to me that it was going to slide and break like 15 feet above him. And sure enough, it did. And then I'm watching him and he's making all this noise and grunting and his stuff's flying all over the place. And
that's awesome.
So yeah, that was a pretty big hit with people then flipping through it and reading through what had happened. Right. It's harder
and hopefully learning at the same time, right?
Totally. Yeah. No, because then exactly where it happened and what they were thinking going into it and afterwards. And I think it is easier for people to write it than it is to stand up in front of a crowd and talk about it. You need to be pretty darn comfortable in your skin. And we would do that too. When some of the experienced folks would get caught, they'd get up and have have a after hours review. Usually they weren't called that. They were pretty informal, and
Right.
oftentimes involved a malted beverage in the locker
Right.
room while people were telling a story about what happened to them and what they learned from it. But that does take some real comfort to get up in front of a
Yeah.
crowd of 30 or 40 of your peers and talk about how you screwed up.
Yeah. Along those lines, talk about a time when your risk profile changed dramatically. When you were
Yeah.
working and it went from here to maybe up to there.
Probably the biggest one I had, and I wasn't the one who triggered the avalanche, but it was the day before or the day after Christmas. So December 26th on 2000, it's either 2007 or 8. And this really popular run off of the top of the mountain called Liberty Bowl, or Stutzman's Bowl is the name of the slide path. It had snowed. We'd run a big avalanche cycle on all the surrounding paths that are a little bit steeper earlier in the year. And then we had kept shooting this particular slope and hadn't gotten any results. We were starting to feel a little bit better about it. Like the vast majority of avalanches that happen inbounds at ski areas happen on the first day, the first time the slopes opened, when skiers get on it the first time. So it's pretty rare to have, and when a skier member of the public triggers an avalanche at a ski area, it's called a post-control release, meaning after control work or mitigation work has happened. So those post-control releases they're pretty rare once a slope has been open, and especially, you get through that first day, and then it becomes, really, they're already infrequent to start out with. They're incredibly rare events, but then it just becomes a complete, black swan outlier type thing.
Yep.
And this particular slope had been open, I think, like around 11 days, probably had, 3,000 skiers ski it before that, a bunch of avalanche mitigation work. It snowed the night before Christmas, on Christmas Eve, and then we shot it the next day with explosives with no results. And then that day, December 26th, there was no new snow. The night before, really no wind. You could still see the black debris from the explosive charge. And it was kind of like soft cut up powder starting to form moguls. And at about 1 PM, we got a report from lift maintenance that one of those folks calls in on the radio, says, "Hey, there's a big avalanche in Liberty Bowl right now." And this thing created like 10 acres of avalanche debris. Big slide. Could have been absolutely tragic. Middle of the day, probably typically it's one of the most crowded days at ski areas that you have, the day after Christmas. So big crowds. Turned out there were 7 people on the slope. They were all just above and to the sides of the crown where it formed. The crown is the top of the avalanche.
Right.
And one of them probably remotely triggered it, which means you can cause an avalanche by being not even on the slab, on the part that's going to detach and fall away off the mountain. But you can trigger it from somewhere else by initiating that failure, and then it travels off sideways. So the most likely explanation is that thing was remotely triggered. And, it was just an eye opener to me. Basically a sleepless night after. I mean, we were out there doing a search with dogs, probing, you name it, till we didn't get down to well after dark. And just incredibly lucky that nothing happened.
What do you think the difference is between working to be compliant and working to increase margin and resilience? Or are they the same thing? Or are they different?
I think there's a difference. I mean, I think policy, it gives you that baseline safety that's going to work well in the vast majority of circumstances. But there's always going to be, because you're working out in nature in a really dynamic environment, there's always going to be something that you haven't trained for and that policy doesn't cover, no matter what. Otherwise you'd have a 400-page manual that no one would read. So you just don't have that level of precision. And I think that the key then is to increase margin when you have those situations that don't fit into the most situations, those extraordinary circumstances where it tends, certain snowpack conditions in our environment is what's creating them, that you really need to bump up your margins when that happens. From from a ski area perspective, or now there's something called remote triggering, which is what I described basically in that event at Big Sky, where you can trigger an avalanche from to the side, from above, or from way below.
Right.
It could be a mile away, and you can trigger an avalanche. As soon as you see that, that's like my biggest red flag that, okay, things, as soon as you see the first one, things aren't like they should be. And we
Right.
need to figure out ways to increase our margin here. We need to,
Right.
back off, be a lot more sensitive. So I guess, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
So from an operational standpoint, that's kind of how I look at it. From a personal standpoint, I've spent a lot of time trying to ponder some really simple way that I can basically do a check on myself in real time in this, real time field-based dynamic environment.
Yeah.
And I hate long acronyms. I mean, since it's more than 3 letters, there are all kinds of things out there like ALP truth. You're going to go through what's A stand for, what's L stand for.
You need another acronym to remember what the acronym was. Yeah.
Totally. But I came up with one that I've been using for about 5 years now that's really helped me. I just say, can I do this, or can I ski it? So CAN, which is pretty simple. I can remember that. My dog could probably remember it. So every time when I'm thinking, is this a good idea? C's consequences, what are the consequences of what I'm going to do? And I'll just try to spend 10 seconds and actually picture it. And the idea with that is to get that little bit of fear going that may, snap you out of it if you are missing obvious signs. And then A, how's the accident report going to read? So, it's hard to envision the pain with breaking a rib or tearing your knee, or, we don't worry about physical injury. Right. It's more, Avalanche Center Director Scott Savage was caught in an avalanche and injured. He was skiing a 38-degree wind-loaded slope. The avalanche danger was rated considerable and said to avoid wind-loaded steep terrain. Right. Then I'm going to look like a moron. I'm going to look like I was dropped when I was a baby or fell out of the truck and hit my head. Right. And that's really powerful we're really worried about what other people think about us. So, C, consequences. A, how's the accident report going to read? And then N, once I ask myself those 2 questions, and then the answer becomes to can I do this, is a binary, either no or hell yes. Nice. And if the answer is, I think I can do this, that's a no. Yeah. So everything that isn't hell yes, this is a good idea, falls into no. And that it just gets it exactly what you're saying. It increases your margin, that you're taking those things that are on the edge. You're creating a bigger buffer by doing that. So I think, the keys with that acronym or thought process, or it only works if you have a lot of experience. Yeah. Because you're not going to be able to, the C falls apart if you don't have a lot of experience, because you don't have that internal database to be able to know what the consequences truly are. Right. So it's not something for recreationists or rookies in any, fairly novice professionals in any field. But for experienced folks, I've caught myself usually once or twice a year, at least, I'll not do something that I would have. I'm not going to say that it saved me from getting hurt, but it kind of, it eliminated
increased your margin.
It increased my margin. And I look at it as like over a lifetime, I'm going to have at least 10,000 real avalanche exposures. I did the math, years ago and figured out, how many times am I going to be doing this where I could get injured or killed. Much more at a place when you're working in a big ski area. I mean, I might have 50 in one day back then, where I just won't have that now. And, so I need to have a pretty darn good, pretty incredibly low likelihood of any individual event to be, less than a 1 in 10,000 or preferably 1 in 100,000 chance of it happening. And it's really hard to envision that, once you get over, say 1 in 100, we can kind of understand 1 in 100, but not really. 1 in 10 we can. The difference between 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 10,000, no one can intuitively decide what that is.
Yep.
There's this old romantic view of the mountain guide or the avalanche professional as the kind of the mountain ninja Chris Lundy, a guy I work with, coined that term. And basically we want to make it so it's kind of the death of the mountain ninja to a certain extent, where the mountain ninja can become more conservative when they're out there, but they can't make seat of the pants moments where they become more aggressive than what their initial plan was, where you green light terrain that was red light to start out with, because that is when you get in trouble.
Yeah, for sure. Plans start changing.
Yeah, at a lot higher rate. Anyhow, I'm not saying every time. I mean, there are times when you do it and works out just fine, but it definitely, from my experience, increases the odds of something bad happening.
Right on. Well, Scott, I appreciate the time. Thanks for being a part of the project. And yeah, it was awesome talking to you.
Great. That was fun, Andy. Thanks a lot for letting me partake.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay.